Hello everyone. In this video we are going to discuss the conflict between markedness and faithfulness constraints in optimality theory. Here are some basic points that we need to know before we really begin to know what is the conflict between these two types of constraints. The basics are a simple definition of constraint is that it's a structural requirement that may be either satisfied or violated by any output form. These two terms are very important, that a constraint may be satisfied or violated. A form is said to satisfy a constraint if it fully meets the structural requirement imposed by a particular constraint. Here, a form means a linguistic form. Let's say a syllable. And a constraint means any type of constraint. For example, markedness and faithfulness. A form not meeting this structural requirement is said to violate it. For the moment, we will just assume there is no degrees of violation, so that output forms are simply categorized by a crude binary criterion as either satisfying or violating a constraint. Forms may satisfy constraints vacuously also, which is the case if a constraint makes requirement about some structural element that is not present in a particular candidate or a form. Here are some more points. OT, the optimality theory, also assumes that in every language or every grammar there is a system of conflicting forces. Conflicting forces means markedness and faithfulness types of constraints are always in conflict, and that is the basic of today's discussion. The forces are embodied by the concept called constraint. So constraint means forces, and those two forces are always in conflict. This is a very crucial point within OT grammar that we will face in a recurring version. Each constraint makes a requirement about some aspect of grammatical output form. Constraints are typically and inherently conflicting. That means to satisfy one constraint implies that another constraint has been violated. No linguistic form can possibly satisfy all constraints simultaneously. Therefore, there must be some mechanism selecting forms that incur lesser violations from other forms that incur more serious violations. This is another very important point, that which candidate will be, if all of the candidates violate constraints they are allowed to violate, then which candidate is chosen as the output form? The answer is the form will be chosen which incurs lesser violations then, and it takes precedence or takes a hierarchical ranking over the forms that incur more serious violations. The selection mechanism also involves hierarchical ranking of constraints, and the higher ranked constraints have priority over lower ranked ones. While constraints are universal, the rankings are not. Differences in ranking are the source of cross-linguistic variation. So why the languages are different from each other if the constraints are universal? The constraints are universal. They are there in our mental lexicon. They are there in the universal grammar. But why languages sound different from each other? Because the ranking of the constraints is different from one language to the other. Let's take an example from a syllable structure constraint called ONSET. As we are already familiar with this term, it's a markedness constraint, and it talks about syllable structure well-formedness. It requires that every syllable must have a consonant in its onset position. Therefore, syllables like CV, CVC, CCV, etc. are well formed, let's say, in a language X. On the other hand, in the same language, syllables like V, VC, VCC, etc. all are not well formed in the particular language X, because none of these candidates or forms have any onset in their repository or in their structure. The English words like monosyllabic it with a VC structure and a disyllabic open with a V.CVC structure are said to violate onset constraint. In the second case, as you can see, the disyllabic open, the first syllable is an onsetless syllable. It begins with a vowel, and that particular syllable violates onset constraint. Similarly, the monosyllabic it also has a structure VC. It has a coda, but it doesn't have a onset. That is why both these syllables, monosyllabic it and the first syllable of the disyllabic open, have violated the onset constraint. On the other hand, English words like monosyllabic man with a CVC and disyllabic hotel with CV.CVC structure are said to satisfy the onset constraint. This is important. Please take a note and try to understand. We are now moving into the constraint categories, the two types of categories that are markedness and faithfulness. These are two major conflicting forces within OT grammar. Markedness constraints are generally used as general denominator for the grammatical factors that exert pressure toward unmarked structures. The force exerted by markedness constraints is counterbalanced by faithfulness constraints that combine all the grammatical factors which try to preserve lexical contrasts. We will try to understand why and how faithfulness constraints try to preserve lexical contrasts. Markedness categories or constraints of language in languages, some types of linguistic structure, for example, segments, segment combination, or prosodic structures, all are universally favored over others. So some segments, for example, pa, ta, ka, are chosen or favored over pha, tha, kha. Similarly, segment combinations like pra, tra, gra are favored over mra, nra, gra, etc. For example, here are a few distinctive categories. Front unrounded vowels are unmarked as compared to front rounded vowels. Similarly, open syllables are unmarked as compared to closed syllables. Short vowels are unmarked as compared to long vowels, and voiceless obstruents are unmarked as compared to voiced obstruents. Please have a look at the IPA and try to figure out what are these sounds like front unrounded and front rounded. Marked structures are generally avoided by languages. For example, among these four categories, which are marked structures? Front rounded vowels, closed syllables, long vowels, and voiced obstruents. As compared to their unmarked categories, these particular classes of sounds or sound combinations are marked. So these marked structures are generally avoided. So languages, if has a selectional procedure to select only pa, ta, ka or ba, da, ga, the language will select pa, ta, ka because these are unmarked sounds. Voiceless obstruents are unmarked. as compared to voiced obstruents. Sometimes they are completely banned by some languages. For example, some languages allow, in fact most of the languages, or you can say all of the languages, do allow short vowels because they are unmarked. Some languages totally ban long vowels because they are marked. So you will have languages, all the languages will have short vowels, but some languages do not allow long vowels. The notion of markedness, that is why, is inherently asymmetrical. So why to choose between unrounded and rounded? Because there is an asymmetrical behavior of linguistic components or linguistic categories. Now let's discuss a few points about faithfulness constraints and how they operate. This mainly counterbalances markedness and observes lexical contrasts. We will try to see what is lexical contrast. A grammar is maximally faithful to a lexical contrast is the one in which output forms are in complete harmony with their lexical inputs with respect to some featural positions. So this is a very specific balancing within a particular faithfulness constraint. For example, a lexical contrast of voicing in obstruents is preserved in output forms regardless of their phonological context. So voicing in obstruent like pataka versus badaga is preserved in output forms. If you remember from the previous discussions, faithfulness constraints try to not have any change between the input and the output. So whatever was there, whether it's voicing of obstruents or something else, the faithfulness constraints would like not to have any disturbance within the mapping of input to output structure. Faithfulness is general requirement for linguistic forms to be realized as close as possible to their lexical basic forms. That means the basic form stands for the input in this case. To express contrasts of meaning, languages need a minimal amount of formal contrasts. Formal contrasts should be preserved in realizations of lexical items and not be eroded or elided or deleted by factors reducing markedness. So, in one hand, the faithfulness constraints want all the inputs to remain as the same in the output. On the other hand, markedness constraints are already there to look after the output forms, and if there is a not very well formed structure, then markedness constraints try to simplify those. While trying to simplify those output forms, faithfulness constraints are violated. If there is a simplification of any input to have the output structure, then faithfulness constraints are violated. So how do the constraint conflict arise? They are always in conflict. Markedness constraints want to make the output structure simplified, and faithfulness constraints do not like any change during the input-output mapping. Whenever some lexical contrast is being preserved, there will be some cost associated in terms of markedness. Since every opposition, one member is always marked and the other member is unmarked. So, markedness is a comparative or relative judgment within a language or linguistic structure. A language can be maximally faithful to meaningful sound contrast only at the expense of an enormous increase in phonological markedness. Conversely, a language can decrease phonological markedness only at the expense of giving up valuable means to express lexical contrast. That is all for this video. Thank you.